theme song, soundtrack, or score can completely change our perception on how we view a movie. For instance, the way Philip Glass uses his score through Errol Morris's The Thin Blue Line changes it from just a procedural documentary into a full feature film with story and characters. It changed how we viewed the film's conclusion and how we followed it from beginning to end. Kids, which featured an entire soundtrack that became the overall theme by The Folk Implosion, helped mold and guide the film into its overall tone. This is the magic of the music of cinema. A score can completely change your perception of a scene you're watching. It will help you emote differently. The sounds, the score, and the music chosen for a film is one of the most important aspects of filmmaking. It could subconsciously tell a viewer if a scene is funny, or sad, or mysterious. Music in movies are a very interesting thing. When one goes digging to find out the combination that had to be involved to get the two together, it can be very surprising. Enter Alex Proyas's 1994 graphic novel adaptation, The Crow. Alex Proyas made two of the most stunning looking and cool films of the 90s. 1998's Dark City and 1994's The Crow. I remember sneaking into the theater to see this movie, and then again, and then another time, and again, and again. I was seriously addicted to this movie in the early summer of 1994, which was unfortunate because though it did okay critically, it was not a box office success, grossing just $50 million off a $23 million budget. Now, a lot of that would change on home video. Since then, though, spawning some fairly atrocious sequels and one okay TV show, the film's gone on to enjoy a lot of cult classic consideration and even cosplay love. Initially developed and financed by Paramount Pictures, they wrote the project off once the tragic death of Brandon Lee caused the production to shut down with an incomplete film. In comes Entertainment Media Investment Corporation, which was created for the sole purpose of buying the film and completing it. And they used some seriously groundbreaking CGI, special effects, and body double techniques to fill in those extra scenes that Lee unfortunately couldn't do. Both River Phoenix and Christian Slater turned down the role of Eric Draven. However, I think it worked out the way it should when it comes to Brandon Lee's performance. He embodied the role, gave it his all, and to this day, I feel it would have made him a megastar. The whole situation sucks, and it still makes me sad to know he'll never get that chance. The soundtrack for the film was set up by Jolene Cherry, a music supervisor turned A&R executive known for her rock expertise. She had a joint publishing venture at Warner Chappell and a consulting deal with Atlantic in the early 90s, where she would go on to work on The Crow. Cherry had supervised the music on 1988's 1969 and 1992's Cuffs, and would follow The Crow the next year with another 90s soundtrack classic, Batman Forever. Say what you want about the film, awesome soundtrack. With her final film being Michael, starring John Adele Dazeem Travolta, she started her very own music label in 2015 and penned a big agreement with Red Distribution for digital and physical media distribution. The original Crow creator, James O'Barr, constantly listened to Joy Division and The Cure while writing the graphic novel, so he was pretty stoked that Robert Smith of The Cure agreed to write the original song of the movie. For some reason, the entire band wasn't there. It was just frontman Robert Smith and drummer Boris Williams. Burn became extremely popular after the soundtrack's release, but until 2016, the band had never performed it live. We're going to find a common trend amongst bands and their contributions to this record and them refusing to play them live. The founding members of Joy Division, who then had become New Order 14 years prior, were asked to record a new version of Love Will Tear Us Apart, but it didn't pan out, and that worked out for everyone because the band did give their seal of approval on Nine Inch Nails' fucking brilliant cover of Joy Division's Dead Souls. Dead Souls went on to become one of the major standouts of the record, getting a ton of radio play. Stone Temple Pilots were initially set to appear on the Crow soundtrack via a song called Only Dying, but Scott Weiland and STP changed their mind after Brandon Lee was killed in that on-set accident, deciding that a darkly satiric song mocking death was probably not a good idea. So because of that, we got Big Empty, which is a fantastic song, and in and of itself, plays almost as a tribute to Brandon Lee. I remember seeing the first trailer for this movie after having heard that Brandon Lee had died. It just felt very fitting. My Life with the Thrill Kill Colts, one of my favorite tracks in the album, After the Flesh. Just like with the rest of the tracks in the film, it is perfectly placed in the film at the right moments. Thrill Kill Colt performed the song while shooting the cameo in the film for over 2 days in what they called some crazy conditions. Founding member Buzz McCoy recalled, "It was an abandoned cement factory, and it was really, I would say, it was about 20 degrees in there because it was cold and damp because it was so cold outside. We were literally freezing with leather and everything on. They had one room that had a heater in it that was for us, but all the kids in the audience that were shirtless and stuff were freezing, and we did that for 2 days." The track plays over a large burning cityscape sequence intercut with the band's warehouse performance playing outside of Michael Wincott's Top Dollar's headquarters and lair, then ramps back up once Eric confronts the group of villains to gather his prey, Skank. Another one of my favorite tracks on the album, and in the film, is Time Baby 3 by Medicine, a band I've been listening to for years. Notice I said in the film as well as the soundtrack. Let me explain. If you thought the track played by Medicine on screen, also in Top Dollar's lair, sounded different than the actual track on the soundtrack, you would be correct. On the soundtrack itself, the band is joined with additional vocals by the Cocteau Twins' dreamy lead singer, Elizabeth Fraser, and is actually titled Time Baby 3. Time Baby 2 is what we see the band perform on stage in the film. Two radically different versions of the same song. The song in the film is the version that was maybe a little more rough around the edges, let's say. So though I love Medicine's performance and the cut of the song in the film, I'd give a tiny advantage to one on the track that made the record. Something about Fraser's voice just gets me every time. The industrial rock band Machines of Loving Grace wrote an original song specifically for the soundtrack, having gotten pretty lucky to have seen the script before this film was even in pre-production. The song really feels like one of the few that are themed after the film and works so well within the aesthetic of the look, the feel, the characters, and the actions. It's a great song. Another track on the album is Rage Against the Machine's Darkness, originally titled, more appropriately for Rage Against the Machine, Darkness of the Greed. The track was recorded in 1991 before the band's first breakup and was intended to appear on one of their demos. But once they hooked back up and then they hooked up with Cherry, they re-recorded it for the soundtrack. It's great, but not one of Rage's best songs. Rage would go on to appear on many soundtracks in the 90s. Kinda goes a little bit against what you'd think they stood for. Other tracks include Violent Femmes doing a track very different than their usual fare, being a more somber and dark track. This is one of the ones I was talking about when I said there's a small pattern going on about bands who perform tracks for this soundtrack that refuse to play it live. But I was one of the few lucky enough in 2017 to see the Violent Femmes perform Color Me Once. They did mention that sometimes when they play it, that's when the crowds leave to go get their beer. For such an uplifting, fun band like Violent Femmes, I guess that sort of makes sense. Some other mentioned tracks on the album, Roland's band doing Ghost Rider, which was written about a Marvel comic book character of the same name. The Jesus and Mary Chains, Snake Driver is awesome, and it was written for the film despite being featured on their 1993 album, The Sounds of Speed. Due to the movie's production halt, the band was able to feature the track on the album. Now getting to the film's score, which was written and composed by New Zealand industrial rocker Graham Revell. Revell had previously scored the Australian-produced thriller Dead Calm, and gave it that sense of melodic insanity that it needed. Excellent film, excellent score. He went on to score many films through the years after The Crow, including From Dusk Till Dawn, The Craft, Suicide Kings, Pitch Black, and Blow, just to name a few. He was always proud of the work he did on The Crow, but felt the audiences didn't take to it as much once hearing it out of context of the film. Sometimes soundtracks do that. It later became a film score that people thought highly of, but at first it just wasn't a popular sell. Some have criticized the score for being too slow or sappy or sad. I feel that's an unfair criticism. Yes, it's an action movie with lots of cool deaths, fights, and guns, but in the end, it's a movie about a man who's lost everything. He's been murdered, watched his wife get raped and murdered, and then had to relive all those experiences before getting justice and finally being laid to rest. In my opinion, Ravel evoked the perfect tone for the movie's main theme. The tracks composed for some of the action scenes are not quite as memorable as some of the sad ones. I feel the sad ones took on a newer meaning after the death of Brandon Lee.
Sir, do care.
And the way they were used throughout the film really helped you emote the sadness and accomplishment of what was done with the crow. Turn to the Grave represented the theme that hangs over the crow and the sad parallels of the film's story and Brandon Lee's untimely death. James O'Barr stated on the Crow DVD that when he met with the movie's execs, they originally wanted to make this a musical starring Michael Jackson. Thank God he laughed uncontrollably and thought they were joking, and basically laughed himself out of the room. For the past decade, there's been rumors, talks, and premature announcements about a Crow reboot. What can I say besides, I hope that never happens. The Crow should be laid to rest so we could always enjoy the beautifully crafted film that we have now in honor of Brandon Lee's final and best performance. Coming out in March of 2000, this American romantic comedy drama film directed by Stephen Frears, who directed one of my favorite movies in 2002, 2 years later, Dirty Pretty Things, and in 2016 directed one of John's favorite films, Florence Foster Jenkins. It stars John Cusack, Jack Black, Todd Luiso, Lisa Bonet, Alex Desert, Joan Cusack, Lily Taylor, Sarah Gilbert, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Eben Hooley, and the legendary cameo from Tim Robbins. The film is based on Nick Hornby's man-centric book about the male perspective on relationships. It's one of the best films of that decade and possibly the first hipster movie of the millennia. In 1995, the book was optioned by Disney Touchstone Pictures and sat in development hell for about 3.5 years. It wasn't until a couple of Disney execs, Joe Roth and recording executive Kathy Nelson, recommended John Cusack and his writing partners, D.V. DeVincentis and Steve Pink, to come along and adapt the book. She worked with those guys on Grosse Pointe Blank, another classic John Cusack movie stuffed with beautiful, wonderful soundtrack. Cusack knew that his writing partners were the closest thing to the character of Rob that he knew, both of them being obsessed vinyl collectors. Shortly after they handed in the treatment, it was greenlit. Once the film was made, Hornby was extremely happy with Cusack's performance, quoting that at times, "It appears to be a film in which John Cusack reads my book." John Cusack is the perfect person to tackle something like this. He's been very genre-friendly throughout his career, and when a lot of people look back on his long career, it does span a lot of pop culture through all of its decades, the 80s, the 90s, and the aughts. So what better person to bring along egotistical, foul-mouthed Rob, the owner of Championship Vinyl. Now, whereas the book, the record store, is located in London, the movie adaptation sets it in Chicago's Wicker Park, which I think is a perfect location. Having gone to college in Chicago and spending much time at Reckless Records in Wicker Park, I almost felt like I was living in the film sometimes. Cusack is tragic and annoying, the exact way that Rob should be played. He smokes like a fiend, he's sort of a slob, he wears goofy oversized Cosby sweaters, and he's completely consumed with, well, himself. Jack Black was a revelation in this movie. He so perfectly represents the counterculture, bratty record hipster that were not as known at the time. Being such a music fan, I love seeing things in the background that you see in this movie. Posters of Elvis Costello and shirts of Pavement and Velvet Underground. Frears definitely did not cheapen out on the set design to make sure this film looked as realistic as possible when depicting 2000s hipsters in Chicago.
Top 5 musical crimes perpetrated by Stevie Wonder in the 80s and 90s, go.
She's kind of Sheryl Crow-ish, crossed with a post-Partridge Family, pre-LA Law, Susan Day kind of thing.
Top 5 side ones, track ones. Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit off of Nevermind.
Oh no, Rob, that's not obvious enough, not at all.
White Light, White Heat, Velvet Underground.
Okay, that would be on my list.
Very nice, Rob.
A sly declaration of new classic status slipped into a list of old safe ones. Very pussy.
It's never really said exactly how old Rob is supposed to be, but Cusack had placed himself right in his early 30s at the time, so it makes sense through the context of the movie that that would be how old he is. Around that age, we recontextualize a lot of relationships we've had in the past in order to see how we can do it right. This is where a lot of revisionist history comes in, you see. Hornby knew this in his novel, that using past relationships and finding out what went wrong could most definitely be the cure for making sure your next one works. As good of an idea as that sounds, it's also megalomaniacal, narcissistic, egotistical, and quote unquote for this time, too old-fashioned. The way Rob goes back and uses these women by reconnecting with them in order to find things out about the past and their relationship has him doing his wrongs all over again to them. It's Catherine Zeta-Jones' Charlie Nicholson who calls him out on this.
Fuck! I knew it! I knew it! I knew it! Fuck! Fuck! Fuck!
What?
You are going through one of those what does it all mean things.
I love Todd Luiso as Dick. His character is incredible and probably the most realistic of the bunch. I've come across these guys my entire career, and especially back in college in Chicago. A complete encyclopedia of music knowledge, socially awkward as hell, and an absolute solid, loyal friend. Now, Rob Gordon is indefensible. He does some awful things, and he says some awful things.
Shut up, Mom!
What? Fucking here, guy! You fucking bitch! Let's work it out!
That's why I love him so much. He is your real human being. I have to say, I truly love Rob because my all-time favorite book is Cash by Johnny Cash.
My all-time favorite book is Johnny Cash's autobiography, Cash by Johnny Cash.
I love what this movie has to say about the male brain and ego. It's raw and in your face every single time that Rob breaks the fourth wall and talks to the audience.
Whereas the way Rex Pickett would depict men in a much more sleazy, mean-spirited manner with nothing in mind but self-indulgence, Hornby wants you to root for your protagonist because he wants you to want him to get better. And Frears and Cusack bring that out perfectly. There are moments of sympathy. We do empathize with Rob. He does want to do right by his friends. He is happy when people do good things. At the same time, he's a man, and he's very full of himself. He's self-righteous, he pities himself, and he's pretentious as fuck. He's realistic because he doesn't think he's a jerk. And as he tells us, the viewers, what's going on, we see right through him.
Did I listen to pop music because I was miserable? Or was I miserable because I listened to pop music?
And there's a lot of character shifts throughout the film. When Laura continuously starts showing up at Rob's place, you see the conflict and the decision that she had to make for herself. Whereas Rob, you would normally think, would start to feel as if he won or was gaining the upper hand, just starts to feel worse. There's some really terrific acting in those scenes. There's so many moments. This movie is about small moments.
You can stay until whenever.
We've done the hard part now. I might as well
We'll just stay for the night then.
The funeral of Laura's dad is a really telling and emotional scene, in which Rob has the biggest revelation to us, the viewer, as he breaks the fourth wall, about just who he is and why he's been the way he has. It took Laura's father dying, who really liked Rob, for Rob to really figure out why all his relationships have failed.
I can see now I never really committed to Laura. I always had one foot out the door, and that prevented me from doing a lot of things. Like thinking about my future, and I guess it made more sense to commit to nothing.
It wasn't about going back and revisiting the old ones. It was about feeling what he needed to feel in order to realize what could make him happy. But even then, ego still gets in the way. When the music columnist comes to him and wants to write an article about him, he jumps at the opportunity and feels that surge of masculine entitlement back in his body. He loved being the center of attention in that case, and makes her a mixtape to really express what his favorite albums are.
Now, the making of a good compilation tape is a very subtle art, many do's and don'ts.
Only to just days later, in his way, propose to Laura, who was very confused by the notion. It's in this scene where we realize he truly is in love with Laura, but it's written all over his face just how confused he is about where he wants things to eventually end up. And that's how we're left with this relationship in this movie. And it can be seen as heartbreaking because this is real life. It's not wrapped up in a bow. She didn't jump up for joy and say yes. There was no grand gesture with hiding the ring in a champagne glass. His face almost gives the expression as if he doesn't want to do this when he asks her. But the film ends on the perfect note, with Barry's Sonic Death Monkey newly titled Kathleen Turner Overdrive. It's a fun scene to leave you on that little bit of tension where Rob doesn't know exactly what's going to happen, but is pleasantly surprised. And it's great to get a nice early taste of Jack Black's amazing musical talents to end the film. I even heard that Tenacious D played the rap party, which is awesome. This is one of my favorite films of the last 20 years, and I never get sick of it. In fact, I'm always sad when the credits roll, even though I love the end track, I Believe, by Stevie Wonder. The soundtrack really goes on, perfectly placing these tracks within the film. Some things just in the background, and some tracks to help evoke the meaning and the purpose of the scene. Tracks from some of my favorite, like Royal True, Eric B. and Rakim, Belle and Sebastian, De La Soul, Grand Funk Railroad, Lou Reed, Velvet Underground, Chemical Brothers, Stiff Little Fingers, Barry White, Al Green, The Vaselines, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, Elvis Costello and the Attractions, and of course, Bruce Springsteen himself.
Give that big final good luck and goodbye to your all-time top 5 and just move on down the road.
If you've ever been a record connoisseur or just your casual record collector, you've probably been in a record store or two where Rob, Dick, and Barry all presided in. The film did pretty well for the studio. It wasn't a massive success, but for what it was, which is sort of a slightly wider released indie movie, it grossed $47 million worldwide, 27 of which came from the States on an estimated $30 million budget. It must have been really expensive to film in Chicago. Plus, I also think that Frears really paid attention to detail in making it the most realistic record store that you would possibly see in that era. Every detail is perfectly crisp, and the story, being mostly dialogue driven, is so tight. High Fidelity has continued to be one of my favorite films of the last 20 years. It's more about the writing and the characters and the believability of all the situations. It's a harsh, brutal love story at its core. A love story that you don't know how it's going to end up, and even by the film's end, you don't know where it's going to go. I love how Hornby's novel unapologetically shows the rough exterior of a man and the narcissistic insecurities of their interior makeup. And so much of this shines through in the choices of vinyl that Rob selects to listen to during his isolation moments. The music and the specific tracks represent his mood. I dare to call this a cult classic other than just a regular modern classic. It's classy, it's super funny, it's got fantastic performances, and I just get lost in this movie every time I watch it. There was a time in my life, especially in film school in Chicago, where I wanted to be Rob. I wanted to live in his world. I wanted to go to that record store every morning and just talk vinyl all day.
You know what I just watched?
Me pulling a can off some moron's fist?
Return of the Jedi.
Oh, look who it is, the fucking human vacuum.
Once a young creative discovers the will and drive to put something on film, it's hard to stop them. Sometimes it's either a student film, or it's just some misguided individual who's been told throughout their lives that they have talent when they don't. That usually results in utter crap. Sometimes someone with huge talent for writing dialogue comes along and understands to focus on their strengths and minimize the other aspects of filmmaking. The World, Kevin Smith. Kevin Smith, The World. Smith attended Vancouver Film School for 4 months, where he met longtime collaborators Scott Mosier and Dave Klein. Smith left halfway through the course, figured he knew enough to proceed, and wanted to save money for his first film. I think he felt the fundamentals were enough based on what he already knew. After his short stint in film school, he moved back to Jersey, and he started working for the Quick Stop, and later realized that it was the perfect place to set the film. The banter and hilarious, insightful conversations he had during shifts at the Quick Stop with his friends gave him many anecdotes, jokes, and monologues to record and write down. Those, along with his love for comics and movies, would help him morph all those elements into a full-fledged screenplay. Around that same time, Smith saw Richard Linklater's Slacker, and he was totally impressed with how Linklater set and shot the film in his hometown of Austin, Texas, rather than some soundstage or production lot. That inspired Smith to become a filmmaker and set the film where he lives. Quoting, "It was the movie that got me off my ass. It was the movie that lit a fire under me. The movie that made me think I could be a filmmaker." Smith didn't know at the time, but later, he would be that inspiration for many filmmakers to come. Once he had written the screenplay for Clerks, he was off and running, with Scott Mosier from film school becoming his most valuable asset. Producer. The rest is a legendary story throughout the industry. Smith maxing out his credit cards, using all of his friends to star in multiple roles, including his mom, shooting the film only in the middle of the night after the store was closed, And of course, originally casting himself in the title role and realizing that was a bad idea. There's many stories about the making of Clerks. There's many stories about Kevin Smith. But some of the stories not quite as known are about the music behind the film. Let's start where it all began. The young early 90s rock band Love Amongst Freaks, who actually wrote the title song that opens the film titled Clerks, were locals to the city of Leonardo in New Jersey, where it was filmed. In the early 90s, members of the band would hit up the local Quick Stop to get coffee and cigarettes. This production actually turned Smith into a huge chain smoker, by the way. Kevin Smith and the guitar player Scott Angley were friends from high school, and often they talked about their band doing the music for the film Kevin was working on. The band recorded the music for the film on a 4-track recorder, but had to re-record the music in a studio when the film was picked up by Miramax in 1994. We'll get to He Who Will Not Be Named later. When the film hit big, so did Love Amongst Freaks. The song Clerks and the other song they did for the movie Berserker were in the movie and soundtrack.
My love for you is like a truck berserker. Would you like some making fuck berserker?
That's fucking funny, man.
Did he say making fuck?
The band actually never released a full-length album until years later. The band did reappear in 1997 for Kevin Smith's third film, Chasing Amy. This was a unique time in film, when indie films mostly hitting the festival circuit without distribution went without score or even original soundtrack. It was when the music supervisors played such a pivotal role in the film's finality. They used their skills to pick songs to set the mood, tone, and feel of a scene. Sometimes it would end up overshadowing the film, but if the right supervisor selecting the right tracks and bands to contribute new tracks came along, it could be the make or break of a film's success, especially on the indie circuit. With small films like this and no orchestra needed, the artist's original songs are just that much more important. The music supervisor for Clerks was Benji Gordon, who at the time was working A&R for Columbia Records before going on to be a huge player in the music marketing industry, and he supposedly is a master archive of music knowledge. He was actually working with Soul Asylum at Columbia at the time he was given Clerks. I doubt it's a coincidence that they ended up doing the title song of the soundtrack as well as doing a music video for the film. The music video was actually directed by Kevin Smith at the location that the movie was shot, the Quick Stop. I bet the store got a lot of attention in the mid-90s. The video was fun, and Soul Asylum frontman Dave Pinner was a total player in it and totally instrumental to its success. He loved being in the video as well, stating, "It was really cool because it was so early in Kevin's career and he threw us into the whole scenario. We're playing hockey with the fucking actors up on the roof of the Quick Stop. I felt like it was all part of the same production, only this was the colorized version of the film." Kevin Smith not only worked his ass off directing this film, but he worked his ass off getting distribution for it, not knowing anything about the distribution process. Luckily, through flyers and a couple of unsuccessful screenings, a Miramax executive, assistant of He Who Will Not Be Named, stumbled upon the film. Unfinished and a little bit bloated still, this executive pressed He Who Will Not Be Named to view it, and it was eventually entered into the Cannes Film Festival. Upon finally getting picked up, a soundtrack was ordered and put in the hands of none other than Benji Gordon. One of my favorite tracks on the soundtrack was Kill the Sex Player, a fucking amazing song by Girls Against Boys. Girls Against Boys were a total under-the-radar influential indie band, alongside the likes and sounds of Hornet's Leg, Silkworm, and Slint, with the thick emphasis on the bass guitar and monotone vocals. Another one of my favorites was Violent Mood Swings by Stabbing Westward, the Thread Mix. Another song on the soundtrack that I couldn't find much information about, but I've always been a huge fan of, was Corrosion of Conformity's Big Problem. Only thing you can really find out about it was that it was featured on the film. No other details have really surfaced. One that I think Smith was probably really excited about was Bash and Pop, Making Me Sick. Bash and Pop, formed by bass player Tommy Stinson from one of my all-time favorite bands, The Replacements, disbanded later on that year in 1994 after the release of this soundtrack, but still managed to contribute an awfully awesome song that fits perfectly with this movie. One of the biggest songs and draws on the album was Alice in Chains' Got Me Wrong. This was a prior recorded song that was a slightly different version that appeared right when the character of Randall appears in the movie. It was released as a single in 1994 after being featured on Clerks. It peaked at number 7 on the Billboard Mainstream Rock Tracks chart, and at number 22 on the Billboard Modern Rock charts. Definitely the biggest song on the soundtrack, despite Soul Asylum having the biggest presence. We move on to Supernova's Chewbacca, which takes place during the large interaction and conversation about what the best Star Wars movie was.
Now, the first one was completed and fully operational before the rebels destroyed it.
Luke blew it up. Give credit where credit's due.
There's also songs from Golden Smog and the Jesus Lizard, as well as a Bad Religion track. Clerks was a movie that was everything for a young wannabe screenwriter still in high school with dreams of making films. One could be obsessed with this movie. I was. I'd seen this movie so many times that right after I graduated high school, I got a job at a liquor store and introduced my fellow liquor store clerks to this soundtrack and this movie. Miraculously, they had never heard of it, and we played it during every work shift we had. I remember getting the CD from Tower Records and being so excited that I ran home so fast, I fell and broke the CD case wide open. Now let's talk briefly about sound. Resourcefulness on an extremely low to no budget film can be the key to its overall success. For instance, how the boom broke in a deleted scene and there was no money for a new one. What do you think Kevin did? They duct taped the shotgun mic to a hockey stick. This is what you do when you're making something of this size. It's resourcefulness, it's creativity, it's indie filmmaking at its grittiest and greatest, in my opinion. Why do you think Quentin Tarantino thinks so highly of Kevin Smith? He knows that he pays attention to the details. Any good film director will pay attention to the details that they think are most significant to their film. And despite what you think about Kevin Smith as a filmmaker, he does that. Kevin Smith even played homage to this in Zack and Miri Make a Porno, where you can see Jeff Anderson and various cast members holding the boom mic, a shotgun mic, duct taped to a hockey stick. Clerks did and always will hold a really special place in my heart. It lets so many of us know that you don't need money. And sometimes you don't even need professionals. You just need people who have your back and who will do anything to support your creative vision. Thank you for watching this marathon of film and vinyl. Stay tuned for more. This is Ben from Cinema Gulp. We drink your cinema.